Hello and welcome to the Puget Sound Navy Museum's exhibit, Patrol Boats on Puget Sound. My name is Megan and I'm the curator of both this museum and of this special exhibit. Since the museum is currently closed, I wanted to give you all a tour of this exhibit. Our museum's focus is on telling the story of the Navy in the Pacific Northwest, and this special exhibit features some of the more unusual boats that have been designed, built, and used here over the decades. First, what are patrol boats? I like to think of them as the counterpart to aircraft carriers, the biggest ships of the Navy. This fleet of giant warships is balanced by a diverse collection of smaller vessels. Patrol boats are usually less than 200 feet long. In comparison, a modern aircraft carrier is more than 1,000 feet long. Patrol boats are small, speedy boats designed for coastal defense and operating very close to shore. They have patrolled Puget Sound for more than a century. Many have even been designed and built here. They are essential both in periods of war and of peace in Puget Sound and around the world. Some of their many roles include protecting Navy bases, intercepting drug smugglers, enforcing navigation laws, and rescuing stranded boaters. Puget Sound's history of patrol boats begins with the 1854 arrival of Jefferson Davis, the 94-foot schooner shown in this drawing. At the time, there was a big seafaring trade in, of all things, illegal wool coming through Canada. The government, of course, really wanted to get their customs revenue. So early patrol boats came to Puget Sound mostly to enforce customs laws, though they also helped ships in distress and served other functions. Now, of course, these tiny boats are hard to send from East Coast shipyards. This is especially true in the 1800s. There's no Panama Canal, so that means an even longer voyage to get here. So it soon became time for Puget Sound boat builders to start making their own patrol boats for service over here. In 1896, 2 patrol boats were built in Port Townsend for the Revenue Cutter Service, a precursor to the Coast Guard. The Guard and the Scout patrolled Puget Sound. Their main jobs included preventing smuggling into Seattle, during this era mostly of opium, and enforcing navigation laws for motorboats. As engines get faster, you've got to make sure nobody's breaking the speed limit out there. Each of these first-generation patrol boats was 65 feet long, with a top speed of 18 knots, or about 20 miles an hour. From the start, patrol boat designers pushed towards faster and faster boats. They've got to keep up with the civilian boats they might be chasing after. Powerful steam engines developed in the late 1800s made patrol boats ever faster. In 1898, the region's first so-called high-speed patrol boat was launched by Seattle's Moran Brothers shipyard. USS Rowan began her career on Puget Sound, later serving at California's Mare Island Navy Yard, until her decommissioning in 1912. She was 170 feet long with a top speed of 26 knots, or around 30 miles an hour. This might not seem too speedy, but for the time period, this meant she could participate in high-speed chases. Rowan was quickly followed by USS Goldsboro in 1899. Built in Portland and commissioned in Bremerton, she sailed from Oregon and California ports for much of her Navy career. After patrolling the Pacific coast during World War I, she returned to Puget Sound in 1919 for the end of her life. She was 198 feet long and could go just a little bit faster than USS Rowan at around 28 knots, or 32 miles per hour. As you'll remember, the very first patrol boats here in Puget Sound came to enforce customs laws. This particular usage for patrol boats surged during the Prohibition era. In 1920, alcohol was banned in America. High-powered rumrunner boats operated by smugglers zipped back and forth between Canada and Puget Sound, bringing illegal liquor here. The Coast Guard turns its attention to catching these smugglers. This growing need for patrol boats accelerated the design and construction of faster patrol boats than ever before. During Prohibition, Bremerton's Puget Sound Navy Yard built dozens of little 36-foot patrol boats for the Coast Guard. Designed especially to chase after Puget Sound's rumrunners, their new gasoline engines enabled speeds of up to 25 knots, or 29 miles an hour. These small, high-speed patrol boats could intercept rumrunner boats before they reached shore. Elsewhere in Puget Sound, boat builders built a fleet of 75-foot Coast Guard patrol boats to enforce Prohibition laws further from shore. Prohibition ended in 1933 with the repeal of the 18th Amendment, but the Prohibition era produced major design and engine technology advances that proved valuable a decade later, when hundreds of small patrol boats were needed for a totally different purpose: World War II. Puget Sound played a huge role in both the development and use of patrol boats by both the Coast Guard and the U.S. Navy during World War II. During the war, Coast Guard boats patrolled harbors throughout the nation, including, of course, all over Puget Sound. Armed with machine guns, they provided wartime protection for the Navy Yard, for Seattle, and all the other cities dotting the shorelines by watching for suspicious activities and enemy boats. At the time, there was a very real fear that the Japanese would attack the U.S. mainland next, and Bremerton, with its Navy Yard, was seen as an important strategic target. Patrol boats played a significant role in protecting the Pacific coast and Puget Sound from attack. Some of these patrol boats were even built locally. Ballinger Boat Works, also known as Kirkland Marine Construction, was among the country's largest builders of 38-foot Coast Guard patrol boats. During the war, more than 60 of these small wooden patrol boats were built over in Kirkland. Just after the war, from 1946 to 1948, Puget Sound Naval Shipyard boat shop apprentices built this model of a 38-foot Coast Guard patrol boat to demonstrate boat building techniques. The other major kind of patrol boat seen in Puget Sound during the war was the PT, or Patrol Torpedo Boat, operated by the Navy. Armed with torpedoes and machine guns, they packed more punch for their size than any other U.S. Navy vessel, carrying lots of firepower. They were also the fastest warship afloat during the war, with a top speed of 45 knots or 52 miles an hour. Though heavily armed, these boats were very lightly armored. The hulls were made of 2 layers of mahogany boards with sheets of airplane fabric and glue in between. The crews were taught that, if attacked, their plan was to speed away quickly, not staying put to fight from their lightly protected hull. One former crew member even told me that the safest spot to stand if being shot at was in the center of the 3 giant Packard engines. They formed a triangle that would stop anything that had pierced the plywood hull. Nearly 700 of these PT boats were built, mostly in New Jersey and New Orleans. They played a key role in the war effort. They served in every active war zone. They could maneuver close to shore, operating in waters as shallow as just 6 feet. They were about 80 feet long and carried 2 officers and a dozen or more enlisted sailors. President John F. Kennedy wrote, "PT boats filled an important need in World War II in shallow waters, complementing the achievements of greater ships in greater seas. This need for small, fast, versatile, strongly armed vessels does not wane." Future President Kennedy's wartime heroics aboard PT-109, leading his crew to safety after his boat had been rammed and sunk, became famous. But because of wartime security restrictions, few people in the Pacific Northwest realized that the famed PT boats also operated on Puget Sound waters far away from active combat zones. There were 3 waves of PT boat activity in Puget Sound during the war. The first visited Puget Sound early in 1942. They had been stationed in Hawaii when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. They were shipped to Puget Sound on their way to combat duty in Alaska. This builder's plaque is from PT-24, a member of the first wave of PT boats to operate here in Puget Sound. When they got here, they practiced torpedo training runs as they awaited shipment to their next duty station in Alaska. During these training runs, PT boats zipped back and forth across the path of the Kalakala Ferry, traveling between Bremerton and Seattle, delighting ferry passengers. John Aiken, a crew member aboard PT-27, later recalled that when his boat began its run toward one side of the ferry, passengers would flock to the rail to watch the fast-approaching patrol boat, causing the ferry to list. The ferry captain was not amused. After a few weeks, Aiken's crew received a stern memo, and their training fun came to an abrupt end. In 1943 and 1944, 2 more squadrons of PT boats were sent through the region, also on their way to Alaska. This model shows one of those boats. Created by one of the museum's volunteers, it actually shows the fictional version that was depicted on the TV show McHale's Navy. Alaska's Aleutians, a chain of more than 100 small rocky islands, form the shortest land route between Japan and the American mainland. It was feared that the Japanese might occupy the islands as a foothold on their way to the west coast of the United States. The PT boats all made the 2,500-mile trek under their own power, and once up in Alaska, their mission was to guard against a possible Japanese invasion of the Aleutian Islands. It was a constant battle to keep the boats maintained while operating in the severe Aleutian conditions. High winds, heavy seas, and jagged shorelines made navigation extremely hazardous here. The Navy even sent sailors a copy of this comic book, preparing them for the conditions they would face. Finally, in the closing months of the war, 36 brand new PT boats that had not yet seen combat were transported here for delivery to Russia. They had been designated for transfer via the Lend-lease program, which allowed the United States to supply Allied countries with military supplies. 3 squadrons of PT boats were sent from the boat factory in New Orleans to the Puget Sound Navy Yard, where they awaited transfer to Russia. Though most PT boats have not survived the decades following the war, one of these final PT boats to come through Puget Sound has. PT 658, shown in the image on the right, was completed in July of 1945. Initially intended for Russia, she was loaded onto a cargo ship and sent to Bremerton, arriving in September right as the war ended. PT 658 has now been fully restored and is located in Portland, Oregon. The lessons learned from these wartime boats, as well as their predecessors during the Prohibition era, set the stage for decades of future patrol boat development. The design, engineering, and construction standards that evolved from these patrol boats would be put into practical use during the Korean and Vietnam Wars. Both the Korean War and Vietnam War required a vast fleet of small boats able to operate along shorelines and inland waterways. Although these wars were fought far from Puget Sound, local boat builders designed and constructed many of the patrol boats used in combat zones. During the Vietnam War, Admiral Horatio Reverto said, "The naval presence is also being felt on the inland waterways, rivers, and canals in Vietnam. Where water is, sailors will go." The Navy's answer to the terrain of Vietnam was the PBR, or Patrol Boat River. It was a small fiberglass patrol boat designed for use in Vietnam's deltas and inland rivers. Each PBR was about 30 feet long, carrying a crew of just 4 sailors. They traveled at speeds approaching 35 knots, or 40 miles per hour. Like World War II-era PT boats, they were heavily armed but lacked armor. They typically carried 4 machine guns and a grenade launcher. The boats were designed to rely on rapid acceleration, maneuverability, and speed to get out of tight situations. Bellingham's United Boat Builders constructed more than 250 U.S. Navy PBRs during the Vietnam War. This made them one of the Navy's major small boat suppliers. Efficient construction methods allowed each PBR to be built in just 8 days. After sea trials up in Bellingham, each boat was delivered to Pier 91 in Seattle. From there, the Navy shipped them to Mare Island in California, where the crews would train to operate them before heading to Vietnam. Now we've reached my favorite local patrol boats. Hydrofoils are ships that fly. Don't they look unusual? This next generation of locally built patrol boats would feature cutting-edge, space-age designs. In the late 1950s, Boeing began applying its aircraft design expertise to the design of hydrofoil patrol boats. Hydrofoils are boats designed to fly above the sea, with water flowing over submerged foils like air flowing over airplane wings. The hydrofoil depends on forward speed to generate lift on its underwater wings, just like an airplane flying through the air. Hydrofoil patrol boats have several advantages over traditional hulls. The underwater wings lift the hull out of the water, reducing drag. The hydrofoil boat's small submerged area reduces the risk of torpedo attacks, and the underwater wings increase stability, enabling hydrofoils to maneuver in rough water. Carrying on a tradition of local innovation, Boeing succeeded in proving the success of this concept through a series of test designs beginning in the 1950s. Early Boeing hydrofoil research resulted in the launching of 3 test designs: Aquajet in 1959, Little Squirt in 1962, and Fresh 1 in 1963. They were between 20 and 53 feet long and tested at speeds approaching 100 miles an hour, greatly adding to our knowledge of how high-speed hydrofoils work. Bremerton's Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, thanks to its proximity to Boeing's facilities, became a hotbed of hydrofoil testing. The U.S. Navy's first operational hydrofoil, USS High Point, was launched in 1962. Operating from the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, she underwent testing at speeds of more than 50 knots. It was hoped that hydrofoils like High Point would join the fleet as anti-submarine warfare vessels. However, testing revealed that the hydrofoil technology was not quite advanced enough to produce a reliable hydrofoil to join the fleet. More research was still needed. Still, they learned a lot through these tests. Building on this research, USS Plainview was built by Lockheed Shipbuilding and Construction Company and commissioned in 1969. She operated out of the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard until 1978. She was 220 feet long, making her the world's largest military hydrofoil. She was used to show the effectiveness of hydrofoils in accomplishing Navy missions like launching torpedoes, firing missiles, and conducting underway replenishments. USS Plainview reminded many crew members of an airplane, with her aluminum construction and Lockheed jet engines. Her bridge was often compared to an airplane cockpit because of the many dials and gauges. Next, USS Tucumcari, again designed by Boeing, was the first weapons-equipped military hydrofoil. The heavily armed Tuck was launched in 1967. She measured 71 feet long and carried a cannon, a mortar, and 4 .50 caliber machine guns. Early Boeing hydrofoil test pilot Vern Salisbury, who'd been a Marine fighter pilot during the Korean War, said that hydrofoils offered more thrills than flying. On testing runs aboard USS Tucumcari, he ran rings around Coast Guard patrol boats and even circled nuclear submarines. He later recalled, "Heads would pop out of the hatches as we would circle." At the time, the top speed, more than 50 knots per hour, was considered classified. After lots of testing in Washington and California, Tucumcari was sent to Vietnam, becoming the first U.S. Navy hydrofoil to see combat duty as she patrolled Vietnam's coastlines. After the success of USS Tucumcari, the Navy asked Boeing to produce a larger armed hydrofoil. The PHM, or Patrol Hydrofoil Missile program, consisted of 6 hydrofoil patrol boats. Launched by Boeing between 1974 and 1982, all 6 were assigned to patrol the waters around Key West, Florida, to combat drug trafficking. When you think about Puget Sound's earliest patrol boats, designed to catch drug and alcohol smugglers, our local patrol boat program has really come full circle. Able to zip around at more than 40 knots in any weather, they were the only U.S. ships that could outrun the speedy boats used by smugglers. Unfortunately, in 1993, the PHMs were decommissioned due to government cutbacks, ending the hydrofoil patrol boat program. Boeing had succeeded in proving the success of the hydrofoil concept, though the technology was ultimately not widely adopted by the Navy. Today, patrol boats are used locally by both the Navy and the Coast Guard for a variety of purposes, including security, law enforcement, and marine safety. In the modern world, as they had during Prohibition, World War II, and the Vietnam War, Puget Sound shipbuilders have responded to military needs for fast, versatile patrol boats. Puget Sound-based manufacturers have recently won major contracts to produce fast response boats for both the Coast Guard and the Navy, for homeland assignment as well as foreign deployment. And both the Navy and the Coast Guard continue to have security responsibilities in Puget Sound, protecting high-value assets like major Navy ships. Armed patrol boats have been especially vital in protecting our national security in the modern era. Meanwhile, the Coast Guard continues to engage in the drug war at sea. Just as the rumrunners of the 1920s smuggled alcohol ashore, present-day drug smugglers utilize all types and sizes of vessels to bring their contraband ashore. Locally built patrol boats continue to be called upon to catch them. From the launching of one of the first U.S. Navy torpedo boats, USS Rowan, in 1898, to the Coast Guard's modern patrol boats, innovative Puget Sound boat builders have developed a significant share of the nation's vast patrol craft. Few people realize the role Puget Sound has played in the evolution of the patrol boats that have operated on local waters since the mid-1800s.